I'm Vinnie Politan. The subject of my investigation, the death of Boston police officer John O'Keefe. Crucial to this case is figuring out what caused John's injuries, getting hit by a car or a brutal attack. Now, the first jury couldn't figure it out. Here's the story. On the night of January 28, 2022, Boston police officer John O'Keefe and his girlfriend Karen Read visited two bars in Canton, Massachusetts, C.F. McCarthy's and the Waterfall Bar and Grill. Later, they proceeded to an after-party at the home of fellow officer Brian Albert. Read dropped O'Keefe off at Albert's residence, but did not enter the house herself. The following morning, concerned by John O'Keefe's absence, Karen Read, along with Jennifer McCabe and Kerry Roberts, searched for him. They discovered O'Keefe unresponsive in a snowbank outside of Albert's home. Despite attempts at CPR, he was pronounced dead at the hospital. An autopsy revealed blunt force trauma and hypothermia as contributing factors to his death. Prosecutors allege that Read, intoxicated, struck O'Keefe with her SUV and left him to die in the snow. Karen Read maintains her innocence, asserting that O'Keefe was attacked inside the house and that she is being framed. Her first trial ended in a mistrial, and the retrial began in April of 2025. The death of John O'Keefe was difficult for everyone involved here. And for obvious reasons. People loved John O'Keefe. He was a man of character. He was a man who, when his sister and brother-in-law passed away within 7 months of each other, he, as a single man, decided to raise his niece and nephew, and did that for years as a Boston police officer, as a single dad, jumping into the shoes of his sister and his brother-in-law, who tragically died at such young ages. Now, what did John O'Keefe look like when he was found? Dead on the lawn in the snow. I want you to take a listen to two descriptions here. One will be from Kerry Roberts, John O'Keefe's good friend, and another will be from his brother, Paul O'Keefe, as they describe what John O'Keefe looked like after he was found.
His body was completely covered, but his head was completely covered, so I started to dig around his face and his eyes, and his left eye was fine, but his right eye looked like it was huge. His legs were covered, his arms were by his side, he was on his back. Karen had lifted up his shirt, so now his shirt was down, but I was doing chest compressions so you could see his clothing. He had blood coming out of his nose and his mouth, and when I put the baby blankets under the back of him, there was blood on the blanket, so I think he had a cut on the back of his head.
Do you recall what woke you up on that morning?
Yes, my mother called me at 6:40 a.m.
Is that something typical?
No. She called and just said, something happened to your brother. They found him in the snow, and they took him to the hospital. I mean, he was pretty banged up. He had his eyes had swelled up. He had a breathing tube in, well, the mask anyway. Blood come down his nose, blood come down his mouth. But what really stood out to me was, the eyes. It was almost as if like there were ping pong balls under his eyelids. They were that swollen.
That was Paul O'Keefe, actually, from the first trial. He was the first witness in the first trial. So a lot of this is so important. I mean, it's difficult for people who loved and cared for John O'Keefe, but it's important for those who have to figure out what happened to John O'Keefe, specifically the jury, and through some of the experts, through the description and what the experts have to say about those descriptions. And all that brings us to the first question in our investigation tonight. What injuries did John O'Keefe have? It's a big part of this. What injuries did he have? You can't figure out or try to figure out what happened unless you know first the results of what happened. Joining me to help figure this all out, John DePietro, host and creator of Road Patrol Live, and Karen Read supporter and Nurse Kim on YouTube and TikTok. Kim Whalen is with us as well. Thank you both for being here. I want to show everyone at home, we're not showing the actual photo, but a recreation of the photo that was shown to this jury inside the courtroom of John O'Keefe's head wound in the back of his head. So let's take a quick look at that, and then we'll talk about it. And there's really two parts of this. First of all, there's a ruler up there showing you the size. This is the back of the head, and what they did is they shaved around the wounds so they would be exposed more. So the dark part, you see, that's his hair, then it's shaved out, and then you see some of those dots within that area, and I think we have labels for them so you can kind of identify them. So you have the laceration on the bottom, the cut, the laceration, then just above it, what was described as abrasions, but also a redness. There's an area, some spots are darker than others, but it's two very distinct types of injuries here. I'll begin with you, Kim, Nurse Kim. When you see this, what thoughts do you have about these particular injuries?
Yeah, Vinnie, I think it was interesting, at least this trial, to hear that we now have what's called a compound injury. So we knew initially about the 2.5 centimeter laceration to Officer John O'Keefe's cranium. But above that, the abrasion is a very distinct mark as well. And for me, Vinnie, this just clearly demonstrates that this was not able to occur from striking one's head on the ground after a perceived, motor vehicle accident per the Commonwealth's theory. His radius of skull that would have made contact with that ground would have been much greater than that 1 inch and that abrasion directly above it. So for me, I have more questions than answers of what those wounds came from.
John DePietro, from your perspective, what story do the wounds on the back of his head tell?
Well, Vinnie, I was in the courtroom when they showed those autopsy photos. Peg O'Keefe, the O'Keefe family, she wasn't in court. It was tough on them. But by all accounts, what I really look at is they had the meteorologists in that talked about that it had been freezing leading up to this. It was freezing temperatures that night as everyone prepared. The region got prepared for a blizzard, biggest snowstorm of the season. And what they believed to happen is what you're looking at is someone who fractured his skull by being flown backwards and then tragically cracking his skull right there on the hard ground that essentially was frozen, almost like a rock. That's basically the Commonwealth's contention, is how he received that blunt force trauma, was being hit by Karen Read and then tragically slamming the back of his head into the hard as rock frozen ground.
Okay, let's take a listen to Dr. Ascorti-Bella, who is the medical examiner, who did the autopsy in all of this. Important testimony, always in every case I've covered here at Court TV, cause and manner of death.
Inevitably, did you come to a conclusion about the manner and cause of Mr. O'Keefe's death? And I'll ask you first about the cause. To a reasonable degree of medical certainty, did you reach a conclusion about the cause of Mr. O'Keefe's death?
Yes. The cause of death was determined to be blunt impact injuries of head and hypothermia, and the manner was undetermined.
Okay, Kim, your thoughts about the combination here of the blunt force trauma and the hypothermia and how they play off one another?
Well, yeah, Vinnie, I think it's 100% apparent per Dr. Ascorti-Bella telling us that the primary cause of death of Officer John O'Keefe was that blunt force impact injury. And the hypothermia, I believe she documented that because his core body temperature was 80.1 upon his arrival at Good Samaritan Hospital on January 29th, 2022. Do I believe that there was hypothermic findings and changes per what she would typically put for a cause of death that was actually related to hypothermia? No. She conceded in her testimony on cross-examination that you would have needed to have at least 50% of those tiny hemorrhages in Officer John O'Keefe's gastric lining to equate to a cause of death that is associated with hypothermia.
John, any other injuries that this jury has heard about that would be consistent with being struck by an SUV?
Well, of course, it's the right arm, which, you know, those on the other side have contended that those are dog bites. That's been a big contention. But according to the testimony in court, that was abrasions. They weren't punctured. A dog, the tooth of a dog, the jaws of a dog would actually puncture the skin. But instead, these were abrasions, which they seem to line up, Vinnie, with the taillight. That the Karen Read, according to the Commonwealth, you know, floored it backwards, struck John O'Keefe, put out his arm, defensive motion, sent him flying backwards. He fractured his skull, was knocked unconscious, and then essentially when they did find him, the body temperature was 80 degrees. And keep it in mind also, the first responders testified they attempted to warm him up. So that's 80 degrees after they had warmed him up on the way to the hospital. But essentially, people that are trying to follow it, that's what they contend happened. She hit him, knocked him out, and then because of the conditions, he essentially froze to death.
All right, a lot of expert testimony here in this case. John DePietro, Nurse Kim Whalen are going to stay with us. Coming up next, what do the injuries tell us about cause and manner of death?
John O'Keefe did not die from being hit by a vehicle, period.
Is Karen Read a killer girlfriend?
She's guilty.
Or the scapegoat in an elaborate cover-up?
Karen Read was framed!
Karen Read is accused of murdering her police officer boyfriend.
And stated repeatedly, I hit him, I hit him.
She may end up taking the stand. Her first trial ended with a hung jury.
They haven't proven anything.
Will a jury finally agree on a verdict?
We know who did it.
The Karen Read Murder Retrial. Live coverage today on Court TV.
The cause of death was determined to be blunt impact injuries of head and hypothermia, and the manner was undetermined.
The medical examiner in every murder trial is a very important witness. In some murder trials, really, really, really important. In others, important, but not central to the case. So what exactly is going on here in the Karen Read case? Let's take a listen to Hank Brennan, the special prosecutor in the case, talking about the injuries that were suffered by the victim, John O'Keefe.
John O'Keefe fell backwards and hit his head after he was clipped by a car. And you're going to hear from a very renowned doctor, a neurosurgeon, who has treated thousands and thousands of head injuries. And the wound on the back of the head, he fell backwards, found the crack in the skull, it's called a basal fracture. It created an injury called counter-coup. After he was hit by a car and fell backwards and hit his head on that hard rock ground, remember there's no snow, it's just a dusting at this point, the back of his brain hits the back of the skull and bounces up. When it bounces up, it leaves marks showing that impact. And this neurosurgeon will tell you, treated thousands of patients, that this injury, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, is counter-coup caused by falling backwards and hitting your head. When the medical examiner for the state looked at it, they generally said blunt force trauma. They had it undetermined.
A detailed description by Hank Brennan, but he's just the prosecutor telling the jury what the evidence is going to show. But how about those injuries and what they actually mean? That's the most important part for the jury. And that brings us to the next question in our investigation. What do John O'Keefe's injuries tell us about cause and manner of death? Now, to prove this to a jury, you bring in an expert. You know, both sides are entitled to bring their own expert to explain how the injuries and what they mean relative to cause and manner of death. So let's bring in our own expert. Let's bring in board-certified forensic pathologist, Dr. Priya Banerjee joining us tonight. Doctor, great to have you here. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Let me ask you a question that everyone's talking about here. Manner of death undetermined.
Mm-hmm.
Is that common? Is that surprising to you in this case?
I actually think it's appropriate. It's not what people want. People want black and white. But I think, so let's just define what that is. And even backtrack more. I'm glad we're talking about John O'Keefe's injuries, not Karen Read. This is who died. Always keep that in mind. The cause of death, that it's head injuries or blunt force head injuries with skull fractures, however it's summarized, isn't really being debated. It's the manner. How did he sustain these injuries? Under what circumstances? And that's the manner. So that's where the investigation, any surveillance, et cetera, comes into play. And really, from a medical examiner standpoint, I've been where Dr. Sporty Bello is. You get, differing facts. Sometimes, obviously, the investigation evolves over a long time, much farther than the even pending autopsy determination. And so I think under these circumstances, when the manner or the investigation is so controversial, can be, both scenarios are potentially leading to the same injury pattern, I think undetermined is appropriate. Undetermined is a manner. It's just a manner we don't use that often.
And what I find interesting about it is that both prosecution and defense are claiming homicide. They're just saying it's someone else that's responsible for that homicide. It's either Karen Read behind the wheel of her SUV or people in the house. So I don't know why the manner wouldn't be homicide unless it's potentially accidental. Could you slip and fall and hit your head that way?
I think, to me, a slip and a hard fall. When I say hard fall, this is the snow frozen ground in the depths of winter, and I don't live far from Dedham. I think we've met in person in Dedham because I was able to drive up. I'm only an hour away in Rhode Island, and so winters are harsh. And those were blizzard conditions. He's covered with snow. I don't know how icy it was, but it looks bad on the video. I don't understand why the intoxication with a slip and fall, a hard fall, where he can't break his fall, isn't under consideration. That, to me, when you fall on a frozen ground, even with ice, it's falling on an ice rink, on a frozen slab. That's hard.
Yeah, and my understanding, I mean, I just, off the top of my head, I'm thinking of someone who slipped and fell and died because of an head injury, Dr. Atkins from the Atkins diet. That's how he passed away. I want you to take a listen to this testimony from the medical examiner, Dr. Sporty Bello, talking about or asked about other evidence of a vehicle striking John O'Keefe.
You did not include in your autopsy in any fashion any discussion of whether Mr. O'Keefe's injuries were consistent with a motor vehicle accident, did you?
No, I did not.
Did you evaluate it all in your autopsy whether Mr. O'Keefe had any injuries consistent with a motor vehicle accident?
Objection. I'll allow that. Yes, I did examine his lower extremities. That is protocol in any case of suspected impact with a motor vehicle. So I did examine his legs, and I did not see any evidence of an impact site. What I look for is some sort of bruise, either on the outside of the leg or bleeding on the inside after the skin is reflected in the soft tissues, or any fracture of the bones of the legs. I did not observe those things.
Okay, Dr. Banerjee, what are your thoughts about that part of her observations and her testimony, talking about the lack of these other injuries?
pertinent negative. It's very, very important. I'm glad she did a thorough autopsy. That is, again, protocol, something I do with any potential pedestrian death, as in Mr. O'Keefe. You know, if there's any potential that someone is a hit and run pedestrian, regardless of what's known at the time of autopsy, you should cut the legs, as she said. You look down the back of the legs, you look all around the legs, on the outside and the inside, as well as x-rays of the bones, and then physically examining the legs and the bones, the muscles, etc. Again, all the way through, outside to inside, to see if there's any hidden bleeding or fracture. Sometimes the fractures are subtle and you don't see them on x-ray. And if she didn't see them, you know, she's quite capable. I think going at the presumed speed that was quoted, I think it was 20, 25 miles an hour backwards. If he was struck, I would suspect there would be some injury. I think it's, you know, it helps the defense in this case that there's no clear strike.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating, because the last jury, I asked one of the jurors who came on the show, what do you think happened? And he said, I still don't know. I still don't know what happened. And I think a lot of it is because of the injuries, lack of injuries, and expert testimony. Well, we've had our expert testify for us tonight, Dr. Priya Banerjee. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Up next, where was DNA found on John O'Keefe's clothing? I'm Vinnie Politan. We continue our investigation of the death of Boston police officer John O'Keefe, who died in the cold on the lawn of another Boston police officer who was never investigated. Prosecutors charged his girlfriend Karen Read, and now a big issue in the case is the DNA evidence. Here's the story. On January 29, 2022, Karen Read discovered the lifeless body of her boyfriend, Boston police officer John O'Keefe, in the snow outside a fellow officer's home in Canton, Massachusetts. Prosecutors allege that Read, after a night of drinking, struck O'Keefe with her SUV and left him to die in the blizzard. She faces charges of second-degree murder, manslaughter while operating under the influence, and leaving the scene of personal injury and death. Read has pleaded not guilty, asserting that she is being framed by law enforcement to shield others involved in John O'Keefe's death. Her first trial ended in a mistrial in July of 2024 due to a hung jury. The retrial began in April and has included a lot of DNA evidence from Karen Read's SUV and from the clothing of John O'Keefe. The question is, who will this evidence help more, the prosecution or the defense? You know, I first started covering this case and this story, I didn't think DNA was going to be a big part of it. It didn't seem to be that kind of case. But it has really become that kind of case because of the DNA that is found, the DNA that isn't found, and the DNA that is found that is not identified. All of it very significant, and I have to think the jury thinks it's significant. Take a listen to the DNA analyst from the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab.
A sample from stain D on right instep of sneaker.
And 11 from your report, you also did some analysis on item 7-18.3.1, is that correct?
Correct.
And what was the description associated with that?
A sample from stain B on top front of gray long sleeve shirt.
And item 7-18.7.1, do you see that as well?
Yes.
And what was the description associated with that item?
A sample from stain F on top front of gray long sleeve shirt.
And lastly, in this group, item 7-18.8.1, what was the description associated with that?
A sample from stain G on back left sleeve of gray long sleeve shirt.
And with respect to each of those last four samples from those items, were you able to generate a DNA profile with respect to each of those 4?
Profiles were generated from them.
And what did you conclude based on the generation of those profiles with those 4 items?
Yeah, so the profiles that were generated were not suitable for comparison.
And if you could explain briefly to the jury, when you say not suitable for comparison, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so 47-3.1, it was a mixture of at least 5 contributors. And at the DNA unit, we validated, basically we tested and make sure that our protocols were we can only interpret mixtures of up to 4 contributors. So I determined that there were 5 contributors, so that makes it too complex for us to do comparisons to it. So it's not suitable for comparison for that reason. And the other 3 items, due to the quality of the profile, they were not suitable for comparison. And basically what that means is that there was such low amounts of DNA that was in the sample that there was a lack of information from the profiles themselves, so they weren't really suitable for comparisons.
A lot of DNA, a lot of unknown DNA in this case. Now, you always have to come back to the big picture. The big picture here. Prosecutors, we know what their story is, right? John O'Keefe is struck by Karen Read. He ends up in the snow, and he's there all night into the early morning hours when Karen Read and 2 women find his body, right? But there's another version of what happened here, which is the defense, that John O'Keefe goes into the house, is ambushed, is I guess, knocked unconscious, and then placed out on the front lawn, which is why the next question in our investigation is very important. Let's take a look at it. Where was DNA found on John O'Keefe's clothing? His clothing was tested, folks. Let's bring in our guest to help us through this, John DePietro, host and creator of Road Patrol Live and Karen Read supporter, and Nurse Kim on YouTube and TikTok. Kim Whalen with us. Let's start with his jeans, his pants that he was wearing, because this is really significant. You're talking about on the upper right leg of the jeans, 3 contributors, John O'Keefe, 2 unknown. Stain B, upper right leg of the jeans, 3 contributors, John O'Keefe and 2 unknown individuals. Stain 3 on the upper right leg of the jeans, 2 contributors, John O'Keefe and unknown individual. Stain D, upper right leg of the jeans, 3 contributors, John O'Keefe and 2 unknown individuals. Stain E, the upper right leg of the jeans, 2 contributors, John O'Keefe and 1 unknown individual. And then unstained areas, jeans exterior, 4 contributors, John O'Keefe and 3 unknown individuals. Kim Whalen, this is important. I think the jury would like to know, I'd like to know, who the unknown DNA belongs to and whether or not we can eliminate all the people that were in the house.
Agreed.
So
yeah, but we don't.
Why don't you think we don't? Why do you think we don't know?
Well, per Andre Porto, they didn't have good quality samples, Vinnie, right? And we know that the Commonwealth did attempt to rule out former Trooper Michael Proctor and Yuri Buchanan as it related to tail light, not Officer John O'Keefe's clothing. But there were other individuals that I believe should have been able to at least offer, potentially to just say, I had nothing to do with this. If there's nothing to hide, then there's nothing to hide. And we do know that there are multiple contributors. So no matter what, and no matter how the cookie crumbles, Vinnie, Karen Read striking Officer John O'Keefe with her Lexus vehicle would not have added up to 4 additional contributors to DNA profiles on Officer John O'Keefe's clothing.
John DePietro, this is a retrial, and we know, prosecutors had time to regroup. Why wouldn't they just do the test? Ask all the people in the house, just give us a swab so we can eliminate you.
Well, Vinnie, as we know, I mean, DNA is everywhere. So someone, he walks into the Waterfall bar, someone gives a bear hug, there's some DNA there. Plus you have the people that
are you saying, John, that they were afraid of the results potentially, and that's why they didn't do it? Because that's what I'm hearing from you right now.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that if there was real evidence, let's just say there were some bloodstains, let's say he was in a fight, I would tend to believe, from what I understand, there'd be far more evidence of DNA. But what I think people don't understand is they're constantly, especially in a social setting, people are drinking, greeting each other, that the DNA is suddenly on their clothes. Plus, as I said, he was worked on by different people. I think if he was beaten in the house and it was a big fight, I think we'd have better samples of DNA. I believe they didn't follow up on it because they just, as Nurse Kim said, they simply didn't have good samples of it.
Let's take a look at his right sneaker. And this is the testimony that we heard from the expert. 5 contributors, too many contributors to be suitable for comparison. Nurse Kim, that just kind of leaves it out there, sort of dangling. What is the significance of the sneaker, and what are your thoughts about the significance of 5 contributors on that sneaker?
Yeah, Vinny. Well, the sneaker gets a little tricky, right? The sneaker has been a little bit tricky, if you ask me, since it's been introduced into evidence in the retrial thus far. But, as Mr. DePietro said, there are instances in which you could get DNA from other contributors on a shoe. But I didn't see, or they didn't report, stains on the sneaker, which I found odd because there was stains all over Officer John O'Keefe's clothing. And that just leaves me with, again, more questions than answers. But you could, in theory, step into any kind of DNA contamination at a bar, any kind of many different things you could be stepping in, unfortunately.
Yeah. Now, John, the issue I have with not testing everyone is that I've been covering trials for a long time at Court TV, a long, long time, including one in that courthouse at around the turn of the century. So I know that prosecutors use DNA when it works for them. You know what I mean? Like if they're trying to solve a case and trying to figure out something, they'll use the DNA and then match it to the person. And then I usually see the person who gets nabbed by the DNA try to say all the innocent explanations for it being there, et cetera. I get it. But prosecutors are willing to use it. And I'm a big goose gander guy. Like what's good for one side is good for the other side. And I'm just a little surprised that prosecutors don't have a little more curiosity about just eliminating people. Make it clearer for this jury that, hey, no one in that house, has their DNA on John O'Keefe, on his shoes, on his pants, et cetera.
Well, I know with the sneaker, John was known as you had to take off your shoes when you went into his house. So it'd be very simple for the niece or the nephew. Hey, moving sneakers, tossing them aside. I think that what it comes down to is they don't view this as a whodunit. They have a clear indication what they believed happened, and they're going with the science that they simply don't have strong enough evidence that would warrant getting DNA from all these different individuals.
I think you hit the nail on the head, John. And now the question for the jury is, are they going to believe that this prosecution and these investigators, had tunnel vision all along, or had an open-eyed investigation? And we've seen... Yeah. I've seen it fall both ways at the end of the case, so we shall see here. Thank you so much, John DePietro, Nurse Kim Whalen, Nurse Kim on TikTok and YouTube. Check out her great, great content, and Road Patrol Live as well. Thank you both so much. Still to come, what does the DNA found on John O'Keefe's clothing tell us?
Did anything stand out in particular about his set of clothing?
In particular, we were missing a sneaker of his. That was very significant to me.
This week,
Diddy facing a jury and potentially years in prison. We'll take you to Manhattan every morning as this trial moves forward.
Opening statements with Julie Grant. Weekday mornings at 8/7 Central on Court TV.
How can anybody think I'm guilty? I said, OJ, everybody thinks you're guilty.
Trial and error. Why did OJ win? Marathon begins Saturday morning, 9/8 Central. Only on Court TV.
As far as the DNA profile, your comparison of each of those 13 different stains on the orange t-shirt and the gray long sleeve shirt, what were your conclusions again as your comparison with the known standard of John O'Keefe?
Yeah, so the profile was interpreted as originating from a single contributor, and the DNA profile from these items is at least 490 octillion times more likely if it originated from John O'Keefe than if it originated from an unknown, unrelated individual. This provides support for an inclusion.
27 zeros. That's what we're talking about here. And you would expect John O'Keefe's DNA to be part of the stains on his shirt, but what is significant, and I think what prosecutors will talk about, is the fact that no one else's DNA was there. So if there was a fight, if there was some confrontation, perhaps someone else could be a contributor to that, but it was clear from this expert that it was just John O'Keefe with the 13 stains that were found on his shirt and on his sweatshirt. But again, if you're getting in a confrontation, right, we always talk about the fingernails of victims, right? Sometimes they'll scratch or get some DNA from their attacker. Take a listen to what he has to say about that.
Item 8-2 was right hand fingernail clippings from John O'Keefe, and item 8-3 were left hand fingernail clippings from John O'Keefe.
So fingernail clippings from both the right and left hand of Mr. O'Keefe.
Correct.
And were you able to generate a DNA profile from those item numbers, the right and left hand fingernail clippings of Mr. O'Keefe?
I was.
And based on, from your comparative analysis of the DNA profile from the right and left hand fingernail clippings, both of Mr. O'Keefe, taken in conjunction with the known standard of John O'Keefe, what did you conclude?
Yeah, so the male DNA profile was interpreted as originated from a single contributor, and the DNA profile from these items is at least 490 octillion times more likely if it originated from John O'Keefe than if it originated from an unknown, unrelated individual. This provides support for an inclusion.
Okay, so we now know from the stains on his shirt and sweatshirt and from his fingernail clippings, it's just John O'Keefe's DNA. If the DNA of someone else was found underneath his fingernails, that would be huge, but it wasn't. If someone else's DNA was found in the stains on his shirts, that would have been huge for the defense, but it's not there according to this witness. But we do know there was DNA, unidentified DNA from unidentified multiple contributors that were found on his clothing. And that brings us to the next question in our investigation. What does the DNA found on John O'Keefe's clothing tell us? What story does it tell us? That there's this unidentified DNA on the jeans, on the sneakers, and on the shirt. Here to further explain DNA is our expert DNA genetic genealogist, CeCe Moore. CeCe, always great to have you and your expertise on the program. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Let me ask you about unidentified DNA, what it tells us, and how complicated it is when there's multiple contributors. We're talking about on the sneakers, 5 unknown individuals. In others, we've had 3, in some 2, and in some 4 contributors to this DNA, some of which, the majority of which is unknown DNA. Explain that to us.
Well, we like to say DNA doesn't lie, but we have to interpret what it's trying to tell us, which we can't do if there isn't a full analysis provided, or at least attempted. And so it really bothers me that there doesn't appear to be an attempt to at least compare to potential known contributors in this case. And I think that we're at a time where there really isn't an excuse for that. Of course, there are going to be times where it's too degraded or there isn't enough. But mixtures absolutely in this day and age can be deconvoluted and they can be analyzed. And that's true for both STR, the traditional type of testing that they've used for decades. There are programs that can help deconvolute and analyze. I read up to 10 different profiles. I know that the witness said they couldn't do more than 4. In genetic genealogy with SNP testing, we can also deconvolute up to 3 profiles sometimes. It kind of depends on various parameters, meaning how much is there from each of those contributors. But it certainly should be attempted. And I don't think it's fair to a jury to ask them to make such an important decision about someone's life without giving them all the facts. And I do see in courtrooms across the country, across the world, that they seem to be really lagging behind technology and what is possible today. And I see this both on the prosecution side and the defense side. Now, we do have to keep in mind, though, that the equipment and technology has gotten very sensitive. And much of this DNA is likely transfer DNA or touch DNA, as we hear it called. And so we don't know if it's even relevant to this case. It could be, might be material to it. Or it could be from something that happened days before. I mean, I hate to say it, but I've known plenty of men who wear their jeans over and over and don't wash them for days or weeks at a time. So we don't even know if that DNA came from that day.
Let me ask you this, because you said you were bothered by not comparing to other potential contributors. What if we're talking about 12 people in a party? What if we're talking about a handful of emergency responders? If they voluntarily swabbed themselves and provided their DNA, how involved is the testing? How complicated is it? How time-consuming is all of that?
I think it should be attempted. That's just my opinion on this. I can't second guess the investigators or what happened in the lab. But from my perspective, I would really like us to get to the point where there is not any unidentified DNA when someone is charged with a crime. I just don't see any reason with the advancements in technology why we can't tell the jury who that DNA belongs to. And so I would hope that if somebody was involved, if they were at that party, if they were among the people that investigated that crime scene, that they would be willing to contribute their DNA in order to answer that question. It's not fair to the defendant to have these questions outstanding. And as I said, I don't think it's fair to the jury to have those questions outstanding. And, it doesn't appear that they attempted in many cases to identify who these contributors were. We can talk about, you said, how long could it take? Well, it could certainly be time intensive. And what does this all come down to? It comes down to budget. Do these agencies have the budget? Do these crime labs have enough staff to do this type of work? But look at how expensive it is in this case that there was a hung jury, and now they're having to redo this whole trial, which has to be costing millions of dollars.
Yeah, what's the cost?
Right? So why not just make the efforts?
Exactly. What's the cost of getting to the truth? I mean, that's the whole point of all this. CeCe Moore, thank you so much. We will certainly be speaking again. The biggest difference in Karen Read's second trial is the jury. I was up there. 12 new members of the community will have the final say in this case. And after taking a look at them, I'll tell you this, they are very young for a jury. And when I was a prosecutor, I'll be honest with you, I didn't like young jurors because they question and are more skeptical of the government, the people in power, like investigators, like state police. Well, we'll see what they have to say in a few more weeks when they have to answer the ultimate question. I'm Vinnie Politan. We'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues.